The sun was setting over the city skyline as Special Agent Michelle Taylor guided her dark blue sedan through the peaceful suburban streets. After wrapping up a challenging case at the FBI field office, she was looking forward to getting home and finally relaxing with a good book. The gentle hum of her car's engine and the soft jazz playing on the radio helped ease the tension from her shoulders. The peaceful drive was suddenly interrupted by the flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Michelle checked her speedometer. She'd have been careful to maintain the speed limit, as always. With years of law enforcement experience, she knew exactly what to do. She turned down the radio, activated her dash camera app on her phone, and carefully pulled over to the side of the road, making sure to position her car safely away from traffic. Through her side mirror, Michelle observed Officer Richard Brooks approaching her vehicle. Something about his body language immediately set off warning bells in her mind. His hand was already resting on his holster, his steps were aggressive, and his face was set in a harsh scowl, all seemingly excessive for a routine traffic stop. Michelle took a deep breath and placed both hands visible on the steering wheel, just as she had taught many junior agents to do during traffic stops. She could hear Officer Brooks's heavy footsteps getting closer, his boots scraping against the asphalt with each step. The officer's flashlight beam swept through her car windows, unnecessarily bright given that the street lights were already illuminating the area. Michelle remained perfectly still, maintaining her professional composure despite the officer's intimidating approach. "License and registration," Officer Brooks barked, not even bothering with the customary greeting. His tone was filled with an unmistakable edge of hostility that seemed completely unwarranted for the situation. "Good evening, officer," Michelle responded calmly, her voice steady and professional. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Officer Brooks's scowl deepened. "I said, license and registration. Now." Michelle nodded slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and calm. "I'm going to reach for my credentials in my purse, officer." She narrated her actions clearly, just as she would expect any civilian to do during a traffic stop. As she reached for her bag, she could see Officer Brooks tense up, his hand gripping his holster tighter. The situation was escalating for no apparent reason, and Michelle's trained instincts told her this was far from a routine traffic stop. She carefully retrieved her FBI credentials along with her driver's license, holding them up where the officer could clearly see them. The gold FBI badge gleamed under the streetlights, its official seal clearly visible. Officer Brooks snatched the documents from her hand, his aggressive movement making it clear that he had already decided how this interaction would go, regardless of who she was or what her credentials showed. Little did he know, this traffic stop would turn into one of the biggest mistakes of his career, and its ripple effects would be felt throughout the entire police department. As he stood there scrutinizing her credentials with obvious skepticism, neither of them realized that this encounter would soon become a turning point in the ongoing conversation about police reform and racial bias in law enforcement. The dash camera continued recording silently, capturing every moment of what was about to become a notorious example of racial profiling gone wrong. The events that would unfold in the next few minutes would not only change both their lives, but would also spark a much-needed change in the department's approach to training and accountability. Officer Brooks stood under the streetlight, turning Special Agent Michelle Taylor's FBI credentials over in his hands with obvious disbelief. His flashlight beam kept darting between her face and her ID photo, as if trying to find some flaw that would prove they were fake. "You expect me to believe these are real?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. "I've seen better fakes at spring break." He tapped the badge with his flashlight, the sound of metal on metal echoing through the quiet street. Michelle maintained her composure, though her heart was racing. Years of FBI training had taught her how to handle tense situations, but this was different. This wasn't a criminal she was facing. This was someone who had sworn to protect and serve. "Officer Brooks," she said calmly, reading his nameplate, "you can verify my credentials by calling the FBI field office." I'd be happy to provide you with a number. She reached slowly for her phone. Don't move, Brooks snapped, his hand immediately going to his holster. Keep your hands where I can see them. His reaction was completely disproportionate to her careful movement. A few cars drove by slowly, their passengers watching the scene unfold. An older couple had stopped on the sidewalk, the woman already holding up her phone to record. Michelle could see more phones appearing in nearby windows, silent witnesses to what was happening. I'm simply trying to help you verify. Michelle began, but Brooks cut her off. Oh, I'm sure you are, he interrupted, his tone mockingly sweet. Just like I'm sure you're going to tell me this expensive car is yours too. He walked around her sit-in, shining his flashlight through every window, as if searching for evidence of some imaginary crime. Michelle took a deep breath, fighting to keep her voice steady. Officer, I've cooperated fully, but I need to understand why I was pulled over. I wasn't speeding, my tags are current, and my lights are all working. Brooks returned to her window, looming over her in what she recognized as a classic intimidation tactic. You made a suspicious turn back there, he claimed, though they both knew it wasn't true. And now you're being confrontational. More patrol cars were arriving now, their lights painting the street in rotating reds and blues. Michelle could see curious neighbors emerging from their homes, drawn by the unnecessary show of force for what should have been a routine traffic stop. Officer Brooks, she tried again, her training kicking in as she attempted to de-escalate the situation. I understand you're doing your job, but there seems to be some misunderstanding. I'm a federal agent, and... Step out of the vehicle, Brooks demanded, cutting her off again. His hand was still resting on his holster, his stance aggressive. May I ask why? Michelle's question was met with an immediate escalation. I said step out of the vehicle. Do not make me tell you again. Brooks's voice had risen to a shout, echoing off the surrounding houses. His face was red with anger, veins visible in his neck. Michelle knew this moment would define everything that followed. As an FBI agent, she understood the importance of following lawful orders, but she also knew her rights were being violated. She reached for her phone again, moving deliberately slow. I'm going to call my supervisor now, she stated clearly, making sure her dashboard camera caught every word. I believe this situation requires... Brooks yanked her car door open with such force that it bounced back. That's it. You're under arrest for disobeying a lawful order and resisting an officer. The growing crowd of onlookers gasped collectively. Phones were raised higher, recording every second of the unfolding injustice. What Officer Brooks didn't realize was that his next actions would not only end his career, but would spark a nationwide conversation about police conduct and racial bias in law enforcement. The night air was thick with tension as red and blue lights continued to flash, illuminating the faces of shocked witnesses. This wasn't just another traffic stop anymore. It was about to become a turning point in the ongoing struggle for justice and accountability in law enforcement. Everything seemed to move in slow motion as Officer Brooks reached for his handcuffs. Special Agent Michelle Taylor could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but her FBI training kicked in, helping her stay focused despite the chaos unfolding around her. Stand up and put your hands behind your back, Brooks ordered, his voice carrying across the now silent street. The gathered crowd watched in stunned disbelief as the scene unfolded before them. Michelle spoke clearly, knowing her dashboard camera was still recording. I'm complying under protest. I want to state for the record that I am an FBI agent being wrongfully arrested. Her voice was steady, though inside she felt a mix of anger and disbelief at the situation. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, unnecessarily tight. Brooks was making a show of it, pushing her slightly forward against her car. More patrol cars had arrived, their lights creating a disco of red and blue that lit up the entire block. Officer, called out an elderly woman from the growing crowd, her phone held high. This isn't right. We all saw what happened. Others murmured in agreement. many recording the incident on their phones. "Clear the area." Brooks shouted at the onlookers, but nobody moved. Instead, more neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Among them was a retired judge who lived 3 houses down, watching the scene with growing concern. Michelle winced as Brooks grabbed her arm to lead her to his patrol car. "I need to make a phone call to my supervisor," she stated firmly. "This is a violation of federal." "You can make all the calls you want down at the station," Brooks interrupted, his grip tightening. He was playing to his audience now, putting on a show of authority that was completely unnecessary. A young couple who had been walking their dog stepped forward. "We got everything on video," the woman called out. "This is wrong, and you know it." Brooks ignored them, focusing instead on reciting the Miranda rights with exaggerated slowness, as if speaking to a child. Michelle stood tall despite the humiliation, her training helping her maintain her dignity even in this difficult moment. As Brooks opened the back door of his patrol car, Michelle caught sight of her reflection in the window. She was still wearing her FBI windbreaker, the golden letters clearly visible under the flashing lights. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. A federal agent being wrongfully arrested while wearing her bureau jacket. "My credentials are still on the front seat of my car," Michelle said calmly, "along with my phone, which has been recording this entire incident. I suggest you secure them properly as evidence." Brooks slammed the patrol car door shut after putting her inside, but Michelle could see him hesitate for a moment, finally realizing that this situation might be more complicated than he'd thought. He returned to her car, snatching up her credentials and phone with obvious frustration. Through the patrol car window, Michelle could see people in the crowd making phone calls, some speaking urgently into their phones. The retired judge was having an animated conversation with another officer who had just arrived, gesturing toward Michelle's car. The night air was filled with the buzz of conversation as neighbors shared what they'd witnessed. Some were already uploading their videos to social media, where the incident would soon go viral. Others were calling local news stations, ensuring this story wouldn't be buried or forgotten. As Officer Brooks got into the driver's seat, Michelle caught fragments of radio chatter from the patrol car's computer. Something was happening. Calls were being made. Questions were being asked. She could sense the first tremors of what would soon become an earthquake in the department. "You're making a serious mistake," Michelle said quietly, knowing the patrol car's camera would pick up her words. "One that's going to have consequences far beyond this traffic stop." Brooks adjusted his rearview mirror to glare at her, but Michelle could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. As they pulled away from the curb, neither of them realized that this ride to the police station would be Officer Brooks's last act as a law enforcement officer. The wheels of justice were already turning, and what happened next would change both their lives forever. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Officer Brooks marched Special Agent Michelle Taylor through the building's main entrance. The night shift officers looked up from their desks, curious about the well-dressed woman in handcuffs wearing the FBI windbreaker. "Got a live one here," Brooks announced proudly, puffing out his chest. "Claims she's FBI. Probably bought the jacket at a costume shop." He chuckled, but no one else joined in. The desk sergeant, a veteran officer with 30 years of experience, studied Michelle's face with growing concern. Brooks began the booking process, typing dramatically into his computer with 2 fingers, making a show of how much paperwork she was causing him. "Hope it was worth it, playing dress-up as a federal agent," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Michelle remained silent, her eyes fixed on the station's wall clock. She knew it wouldn't be long now. The videos from the scene were probably already circulating online, and her team would be missing her at the office. The desk phone rang, piercing the quiet station atmosphere. The sergeant picked it up, his expression changing as he listened. "Yes, sir. Yes, she's here. Right away, sir." He placed the phone down slowly, looking at Brooks with a mix of disbelief and anger. "Brooks," the sergeant called out, his voice heavy with authority. "Step away from that computer. Right now." But I'm not finished with. The station doors burst open. Police Chief Richardson strode in, followed by Assistant Director Clark of the FBI. The room fell silent except for the sound of their footsteps on the linoleum floor. "Remove those handcuffs immediately," the chief ordered, his face red with barely contained fury. Brooks stood frozen, the color draining from his face as he finally realized the magnitude of his mistake. The assistant director quickly moved to Michelle, concern evident on his face. "Agent Taylor, are you all right? We've been trying to reach you for the past hour about the Wilson case." As the handcuffs were removed, Michelle rubbed her wrists but maintained her professional demeanor. "I apologize for the delay, sir. I encountered some unexpected interference while heading home." The chief was now reading through Brooks's preliminary report, his face growing darker with each line. "A suspicious turn? Resisting arrest? What kind of fiction is this, Officer Brooks?" Brooks stammered. I thought. The car seemed. "The car seemed what?" the chief demanded. "Too nice for someone of her race to be driving. Is that what you're trying to say?" The other officers in the station had stopped pretending to work, watching the scene unfold. Some were shaking their heads. Others looked embarrassed to be wearing the same uniform as Brooks. "Chief," Michelle spoke up, her voice clear and professional. "I have dashboard camera footage of the entire incident, as well as numerous civilian witnesses who recorded everything. I believe this presents an opportunity for departmental review and reform rather than just individual punishment." The assistant director nodded approvingly. Michelle was thinking like a true FBI agent, seeing the bigger picture beyond personal vindication. The chief turned to Brooks, who had shrunk into himself, looking nothing like the intimidating figure from earlier. "Officer Brooks, surrender your badge and gun. You're suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation." But, Brooks spluttered, his hands shaking as he unclipped his badge. "And that's just the beginning," the chief continued. "The FBI will be conducting their own investigation into civil rights violations. I hope your prejudices were worth throwing away your career." The station had gone completely still. Every officer present knew they were witnessing a moment that would change the department forever. On the wall-mounted TV, muted breaking news footage showed cell phone videos from the traffic stop, already going viral across social media. "Agent Taylor," the chief said, his tone apologetic. "I know this won't make up for what happened, but I want you to know that we'll be using this incident to implement mandatory bias training and review all of Officer Brooks's previous arrests." Michelle nodded, understanding that this moment could lead to real change. As she gathered her belongings from the evidence desk, she could hear the assistant director on the phone, already setting up meetings with the Department of Justice. The night wasn't over yet, but the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Officer Brooks stood alone in the corner, watching his career crumble around him, while the woman he had wrongfully arrested was being treated with the respect and dignity she deserved. It was a powerful reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, would eventually prevail. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Internal Affairs office as investigators pored over Officer Brooks's personnel file. What had started as a single incident was quickly unraveling into something much bigger. "Look at this," Detective Chen said, pushing a stack of complaints across the desk to her partner. 17 similar incidents in the past year alone. All minorities, all during routine traffic stops. She shook her head in disbelief as she sipped her coffee. The investigation team had set up a dedicated hotline for people to report their experiences with Brooks, and the phones hadn't stopped ringing. Each call revealed a similar pattern: unnecessary stops, aggressive behavior, and clear bias. In a nearby conference room, Special Agent Michelle Taylor sat with FBI analysts, reviewing bodycam footage from Brooks's previous arrests. The screens showed incident after incident of questionable stops and escalated situations. "This one's from just last month," an analyst pointed out. The footage showed Brooks harassing a Hispanic business owner for suspicious behavior. The man had been closing his own store for the night. Michelle typed notes into her laptop, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "Cross-reference this with the dispatch logs," she instructed. "I want to know if these stops were even called in properly." Down the hall, Police Chief Richardson was dealing with a media firestorm. News vans had been parked outside the station since dawn, all wanting statements about the viral videos of Michelle's arrest. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from the mayor's office, each one more urgent than the last. "Sir," his assistant called from the doorway, "the civil rights attorneys are here for the 2 o'clock meeting." The chief straightened his tie, knowing this was just the beginning. The department's reputation was on the line, and more importantly, the public's trust was at stake. Meanwhile, in another part of the building, community members were coming forward to share their stories. A young teacher described being detained for looking suspicious while grading papers in her parked car. A retired veteran talked about being harassed while walking in his own neighborhood. "I never filed a complaint," the veteran admitted, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I didn't think anyone would believe me over a police officer." The investigation team worked late into the night, ordering takeout as they connected the dots. They created a timeline on a large whiteboard, mapping out patterns of behavior that stretched back years. Red pins marked incidents of excessive force, blue for unlawful stops, yellow for civilian complaints. How did nobody catch this sooner? Detective Chen wondered aloud, staring at the growing web of incidents. "People caught it," her partner replied, holding up a thick folder. "Look at all these complaints. They just got buried in the system." In the forensics lab, tech experts were analyzing Brooks's work computer and phone records. They discovered racist messages sent to fellow officers, many of whom had either ignored them or responded with uncomfortable emojis. The investigation spread beyond Brooks himself, looking into who had enabled his behavior by turning a blind eye. Senior officers who had dismissed complaints were called in for questioning. Training procedures were scrutinized. The department's entire complaint system was being pulled apart and examined. Social media continued to buzz with the story. Michelle's dashcam footage had been viewed millions of times, sparking heated discussions about police reform. Local community leaders called for systematic changes, not just the punishment of one officer. As the sun set on another long day of investigation, Michelle sat in her office at the FBI, reviewing the preliminary findings. Her own incident, though traumatic, had opened the door to addressing years of unchecked bias and abuse of power. "Agent Taylor," her supervisor said, knocking on her doorframe. "The Department of Justice wants to use this case as part of their National Police Reform Initiative. They think it could help change departments across the country." Michelle nodded, knowing that what had happened to her might help prevent similar incidents in the future. The investigation wasn't just about one bad officer anymore. It was about fixing a system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. On her desk, the phone lit up with another message. Another witness had come forward, ready to share their story. The investigation would continue, peeling back layers of systemic issues that had been hidden for far too long. The police department's hearing room was packed to capacity. Officer Brooks sat alone at a table, looking much smaller without his uniform and badge. His eyes darted nervously between the review board members seated before him and the crowd of community members filling the rows behind. Police Chief Richardson adjusted his microphone and cleared his throat. "This disciplinary hearing is now in session. Officer Richard Brooks, you face multiple charges of misconduct, racial profiling, and abuse of authority." In the front row, Special Agent Michelle Taylor sat with her FBI colleagues, her presence a silent reminder of the incident that had started it all. Next to her was Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who had finally found the courage to speak up about her own encounter with Brooks 2 years ago. "The evidence before us is overwhelming," the chief continued, lifting a thick folder. over 50 verified complaints of racial profiling, 23 instances of excessive force, documented patterns of targeting minorities during routine traffic stops. Brooks shifted uncomfortably in his chair as video clips played on the large screen behind him. His own body camera had betrayed him, recording years of inappropriate behavior and biased comments. The footage from Michelle's arrest played next, causing murmurs of anger from the audience. "Your actions have not only violated department policy," a board member spoke up, her voice firm. "They've violated the basic trust between law enforcement and the community we serve." Outside the hearing room, news crews clustered around the building's entrance. The story had caught national attention, becoming a symbol of the ongoing struggle for police accountability. Social media buzzed with live updates from reporters inside the hearing. Brooks's union representative had already distanced himself from the case, calling it indefensible. Other officers in the department had come forward, sharing stories of how they tried to report Brooks's behavior in the past but were ignored by supervisors. "Would any of the victims like to speak?" the chief asked, looking toward the assembled crowd. Michelle stood first, her voice steady as she addressed the board. "This isn't about revenge," she began. "It's about accountability and change. Officer Brooks's actions reflect a deeper problem that needs to be addressed." One by one, others stood to share their stories. A young college student described being held at gunpoint during a routine traffic stop. A local business owner talked about repeated harassment that almost caused him to close his shop. Brooks stared at his hands, unable to meet the eyes of those he had wronged. His lawyer had advised him to show remorse, but the evidence made it clear that his actions weren't isolated incidents or mistakes. They were part of a deliberate pattern. "The department has failed these citizens," Chief Richardson acknowledged, his voice heavy with responsibility. "Officer Brooks's behavior was unacceptable, but we also failed by not stopping it sooner." The hearing stretched into the afternoon. Evidence mounted as internal affairs investigators presented their findings. Brooks's computer records revealed racist jokes sent to colleagues. His arrest records showed clear patterns of discrimination. His dash cam footage exposed countless instances of harassment. Finally, the board reached their decision. Chief Richardson stood, his expression grave. "Officer Richard Brooks, you are hereby terminated from the police department, effective immediately. Your law enforcement certification will be revoked, and all cases you were involved in will be reviewed for potential civil rights violations." The room erupted in mixed reactions: relief from the victims, quiet satisfaction from fellow officers who had long wanted Brooks removed, and shocked silence from Brooks himself as the reality of his situation sank in. Furthermore, the chief continued, "This case has exposed serious flaws in our oversight system. Starting next week, we're implementing new training programs and complaint procedures. Every officer will undergo additional bias training, and we're establishing a civilian review board." As people filed out of the hearing room, Michelle paused to speak with Mrs. Rodriguez and other victims. They had formed an informal support group, working together to ensure their experiences led to real change in the department. The sun was setting as Michelle left the building, casting long shadows across the steps. Reporters called out questions, but she simply smiled and kept walking. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a larger movement for accountability and reform in law enforcement. 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop. The Police Academy auditorium was filled to capacity as Special Agent Michelle Taylor stood at the podium, addressing the newest class of police recruits. Behind her, a large screen showed footage from the night of her arrest, now used as a teaching tool for what not to do. "Your badge is a symbol of public trust," Michelle said, her voice carrying through the quiet room. "Every interaction you have with a citizen is an opportunity to either build or break that trust." The recruits sat straight in their chairs, many taking notes. This wasn't just another required lecture. It was a real-world lesson of consequences and responsibility. In the back of the room, Chief Richardson nodded approvingly. The department had gone through major changes since the incident. "We've implemented a new system at the department," the chief added, stepping forward. "Every complaint is now reviewed by both internal affairs and a civilian oversight board. Body cameras are mandatory and can't be turned off during any interaction with the public." The changes weren't just local. Police departments across the country had started using Michelle's case in their training programs. The dashcam footage, though difficult to watch, had become a powerful tool for teaching officers about biased and proper conduct. After the lecture, Michelle walked through the renovated police station. The walls now displayed a new code of conduct, emphasizing respect and equality. The complaint filing process had been simplified, with forms available in multiple languages. A newly established community outreach office was busy with visitors. Agent Taylor, called Mrs. Rodriguez, now a member of the Civilian Oversight Board. She was heading to a meeting with other board members, her badge proudly displayed. "We're reviewing the quarterly statistics today. Complaints are down 60%. The positive changes extended beyond just policies. Officer Chen, who had helped investigate Brooks's case, had been promoted to lead the new bias training unit. She was currently in a meeting room, conducting a workshop with veteran officers about recognizing and addressing unconscious prejudices. In the station's break room, Michelle spotted a young officer comforting a nervous teenager who had come to file a report. The officer was patient, kind, and professional, exactly the kind of change the department had been working toward. "You know," the chief said, joining Michelle by the coffee machine, "your case changed more than just our department. It started a nationwide conversation about accountability in law enforcement." He wasn't exaggerating. The FBI had developed a new training program based on the incident, which was being shared with law enforcement agencies across the country. Michelle herself had been promoted to lead a new civil rights task force, working to prevent similar incidents and ensure accountability. The local community had changed too. The neighborhood where Michelle was arrested had formed a community watch program, working alongside the police rather than fearing them. Regular town halls brought citizens and officers together for open discussions about concerns and improvements. As for former Officer Brooks, he had become a cautionary tale in police academies nationwide. His actions had cost him not just his job, but his entire career in law enforcement. More importantly, his case had helped expose and address systemic problems that had gone unchecked for too long. Later that evening, Michelle stood in the parking lot where it all began. A community center had been built nearby, named after Mrs. Rodriguez in honor of her advocacy work. Inside, citizens and police officers regularly met for coffee and conversation, breaking down barriers and building understanding. "Ready for the community meeting?" asked Officer Chen, walking up with a stack of surveys. The department now conducted regular feedback sessions with residents, actually listening to their concerns and suggestions. Michelle smiled, remembering how a single traffic stop had sparked such significant change. "You know what amazes me most?" she said as they walked toward the community center. "It's not just about punishing bad behavior anymore. It's about creating a culture where that behavior isn't tolerated in the first place." Inside the center, people were gathering for the evening's meeting. Officers chatted casually with residents, their interactions marked by mutual respect. On the wall, a framed photo showed the graduating class of new recruits, the most diverse in the department's history. The story of that night hadn't ended with Brooks's firing. Instead, it had become a beginning, the start of real change, meaningful reform, and a new way of thinking about police-community relations. As Michelle took her seat at the meeting, she knew that while one chapter had closed, an even more important one was still being written.